one of the things we wanted to come together and talk about is how architecture impacts how we experience art. It impacts our very idea of art. And as Kulapat mentioned, I've just founded a new organization called the Judith Center, and our mission is to look at how sexism is still occurring all the time around us, and we're going to be doing a lot of projects with contemporary artists. Our first project is to produce 50 posters with many artists and to exhibit them across the United States, working with hopefully 30 university art museums. A few museum directors are here tonight who are collaborating with us, and we're very excited. And we're going to be responding to issues in their communities, like case studies. So, as Kulapat mentioned, at the Felix Art Fair tomorrow, our first exhibition begins. We're attempting to pay homage to many people who have worked in this space before us, and we've done a collaboration with the Center for the Study of Political Graphics. That's an archive of 90,000 political posters in Culver City. If you don't know about it, it's open to the public. It's mind-blowing. And we've borrowed 20 posters, and we've commissioned 9 contemporary artists to make responses. So those will be in the halls around the pool at the art fair. And then, as Kulapat mentioned, on Saturday, there's a fabulous panel talk with some excellent printmakers who are working in the 70s and 80s in Los Angeles, who have been under-recognized, in my opinion. So tonight, we have gathered this group of incredible people here, and I'm going to attempt to introduce them, but they'll be telling us more about themselves. So I'll start with Jaye, and I'm sorry, Jaye, please pronounce your last name for me because
Buchbinder.
Yes, yeah. Buchbinder, thank you. Jaye is with EMECO, and they're our hosts for this evening in this wonderful location. Jaye is a fabulous furniture engineer, and we're going to hear a lot more from her on that topic. We then have Michelle Wu, who is a creative producer and the co-founder of Four Freedoms. That is sort of my light on this path, and I'm very excited to hear what Michelle's going to say, and it's so wonderful that she could be joining us, particularly in this busy week. Then we have Leigh Arnold from the Nasher Museum. Leigh recently, thank you, I'm sorry, the Nasher Sculpture Center.
Just because there's a Nasher Museum at Duke, and we often get confused.
I see, great. And Leigh is a curator there. And she recently curated Groundswell, the Women of Land Art, and that's one of her specialties, which was an incredible exhibition that ran last year into the early part of this year. And then next to me we have Tamar Halpern, who is a fabulous artist and who is also working with us at the Judith Center as a volunteer, and I'm so honored that you could join us. So with that, I'm going to pass it back to Kulapat and let the fun begin.
So I think that would be fun for each of us to ask each other this question as a way of starting the conversation, hopefully to engage everyone in the room as well into a real salon kind of moment. So my first question is to you, Leigh, about the Nasher Sculpture Center, which I know very well even before its fruition. Many of you who don't know, it's a celebrated sculpture center in Dallas, designed by Renzo Piano, at the time for Ray and Patsy Nasher, who I have a lot of to meet, and even saw their sculpture collection in their homes as well as their shopping centers, right? Which is part of that. It's come from a very personal vision that going to a public institution. It's one of the most celebrated art destinations in Texas and in America and the world as well. But one thing, it's designed in a very specific manner. It was designed to a very specific collection, right? And that museum or that sculpture center now has moved forward. In this case, no pun intended, it also has a glass ceiling, which is, Renzo liked to use with the louvers on the top, right? So to diffuse the light and things like that. But it's so specific. It pay homage to the Kimball Art Museum, its vault ceiling. It's so specifically planned that when I saw the shows they put that together, I can't help thinking, wow, the curators and the preparator and the exhibit designer really have to work with the architecture, because the walls are stone, the floor is wood, the ceiling is glass. How can you make this rather specific architecture work with your narrative, especially with the show that you just did, which is the Grasswell. So I want to talk to you about that because you've been there for 10 years, working on so many shows together. And so how experience working, how architecture define you and you then kick it back.
Thank you for that question, and Kathryn, thank you for having me on. And thank you for the description of the Nasher Sculpture Center. I mean, we don't have visuals and I'm terrible at describing things, but the glass ceiling is probably the hardest thing to contend with, especially when you're showing work that's light sensitive or just delicate in general. This glass ceiling became even more problematic with the erection of this horrible phallic glass building next to us that just shoots so much light.
A lot of metaphor. All of us gonna go home a little bit like with our tail in our legs.
So exacerbating a problem that already exists. So even without doing anything to protect the sculptures in terms of putting up scrim or anything, we also have to contend with this afternoon light where the sun exists in two places in the sky, thanks to this building that's next door. So with our permanent collection, which contains, its highlights are mostly modern Eurocentric white male masters, Picasso, Matisse, Giacometti, Henry Moore, etc. And of course, those are all materials that are done in bronze or stone, metal, things that are very durable and not, they can last forever and they can have the sun shining on them for years, although our conservator would argue not. But that to say, as the collection moved forward, we were also looking into major gaps in our collection. Of course, we only had the work of 5 women artists in our collection, which numbers about 500 objects. That's pretty poor representation, poor parity. And as you also move forward in time, the materials that artists are working with get less and less traditional. And then you also think about the artists who have less access to bronze casting, to stone cutting, to these types of more durable materials. And they're often artists who are women, often artists who are artists of color, who just don't have access to these more traditional, durable materials. So now we're confronted with this question of what we're calling at the Nasher display equity. How do you display work that is in this more delicate, quote unquote, condition, works on paper, sculptures in paper, or anything that's painted, essentially, video, any type of media, photography, drawings, etc. So how do you display those works in what we have started drifting away from describing as our main galleries? The main galleries are on the street. Those are all the galleries that have a glass ceiling. There is one gallery in our lower level, our basement, that is the white box, the white cube gallery space that Renzo Piano designed with the intention of showing light-sensitive work. But this becomes an issue because you do a show with Betty Saar, and which we did, the first show we opened with after the pandemic, and it was in our lower level gallery because that's where we could show the work without altering the architecture of the main floor galleries. Which then it opens up all these questions of this work, which is incredibly challenging. It's highlighting racisms, all of this horrible violence of our past, and we're putting it in our basement. That's not a great look. So we're starting to push back against the architecture in ways that I think there was a lot of resistance in probably the first 10 years of the museum's existence, because it was so much about honoring Renzo Piano's design, honoring the architecture, that almost the experience of the art was taking, short shrift to that experience. So pushing back means installing scrims, which people who love the architecture will walk into a gallery with scrims in it and bemoan the fact they can't see the sky like they've always seen it, or see the work in natural light. And to that I say, just come back another time. So we're installing scrims. We install vinyls now on the windows. We still have to deal with the fact that we have stone walls, but we work with incredible preps who are able to design ways of hanging. I worked with Kathryn Andrews to do, we took the show that you organized at the MCA Chicago, and you remember your enormous paintings on aluminum. Are they aluminum? And how much did they weigh?
Too much.
Too much.
Always too much.
In a normal museum, you just tack them on the wall. We had to construct all sorts of things and straps to hang them essentially. So we're always battling it. And then there's also the fact that it's like built with the golden mean. So it's like all of the stones are 2 feet in height and 4 feet in width, which is great. So you can stand in a gallery and be like, okay, we have a 10-foot sculpture, so just count the blocks. That's how high you know it's going to be. All the pieces of the wood that makes up the floor, they're all 8 inches wide. So you know the dimensions of the space. Everything has its dimensions. But that means they also have all of these lines and all of these ways of messing with your viewpoint. But just to wrap this up, with Groundswell, this is a show that included nothing but sensitive material. A lot of archival photography, drawings, works on paper, actual soil, actual earth, actual clay. And it was all of this in our main floor galleries, and it was very important that we weren't going to try and shove everything into one space to, give the building back. We took it back from the building, and we made this show that, it felt a little bit more contained. It didn't have that connection to the natural light that I know a lot of people really love about the experience of the Nasher. But, let's fight for display equity. Let's fight for showing these objects that really deserve to be seen in the main galleries.
Well, I can just add to that quickly and maybe give context to this as well, because interesting, because it's kind of not intended sexism, in the sense that, of course, even at the Bauhaus, the women artists doing textile, right, are doing soft materials, because of course there's a unconscious bias, they cannot handle wood, they cannot handle metal, so therefore they kind of weaving and textile and paper and poster and prints, right? Which in your case, it's such an amazing example to say that this museum doesn't allow those materials to be displayed without changing the nature of the building. Which I recently talked to a curator at the Manila as well. The Manila collection in Houston is counted one of the best museums, also by Renzo Piano in Houston, very revered. And not to be named, but I was talking to the curator, and they said, "Oh, please, I really need to look for materials that are not light sensitive because we need to show them in this space." Yeah. And it's becoming, because at one point, museums, as an architect who designed museums, at one point, light was everything, right? Light was what we need to celebrate. This had come from Le Corbusier, it come from Louis Kahn and other things. But now we realize how much damaging it is to materials. But it's interesting that effect is coming on this, who made what and what can be shown, which is such a unconscious politics. But so thank you for that point. Absolutely. Okay, Kathryn.
I wanted to follow up on a couple points you made, Leigh. One being this idea that students are coming to the museum frequently, and they're going through the galleries, and the upper floors are predominantly men, and downstairs are women, and in that example, women of color. And it's such a sort of sad but real story of how bias is ongoing right now in this moment. And but it's an example that I think you don't think about, right? You just think, oh, the museum's doing their best, they've got a show of a woman, a show of a man, and let's go see it, right? And so it's a very good example of the ways in which bias is sort of unwittingly being reinforced. Another thing I wanted to mention about it is how deeply economics are tied to what you're describing. Women didn't have access to a lot of resources to produce certain kinds of works. They weren't showing in galleries largely. The numbers were so skewed, and we know now even in the art market there's still huge discrepancies, and that's very applicable to non-binary persons as well. And so, but in addition to that, in your examples, if you want to show those kinds of exhibitions on the upper floor, a lot more resource has to go into actually fighting against the architecture, and that's raising money. It's like, what, another $50,000 the director has to get on the phone to make calls about. So these are very real obstacles. With all of that in mind, I wanted to shift the conversation for a second and take it both to Michelle and Jaye to talk a little bit about you guys' experience encountering sort of sexism as workers, because I think that's another part of this puzzle, and it's very much about what does it mean when we don't have diversity in the production side and people aren't bringing these questions to the table on the front end. So with that, I'll just pass it to you guys and you can fight it out.
Well, it's, excuse me, it's interesting. I'm in a room full of architects and designers, and I don't know very much about either. And it's funny because the organization that I run, which is called Four Freedoms, we don't actually even have a physical space from which we work at. We're like, we're very ethereal all the way around. But in any case, I think we like to think of ourselves and other artists and makers as cultural architects. So I like to think of architecture from that standpoint. And something we think a lot about with our work is how unconscious bias affects our ability to show up authentically. And I think as people who are making things and taking risks and constantly failing, begging foundations for money, trying to sell our work, we're constantly battling expectations, things that we think people want us to make, you know, representing ourselves in ways that are disingenuous. And so a lot of the programming that we've been doing, a lot of the work that we end up commissioning, really, and I don't even like the word commissioning because that feels very transactional, but I would say that we really try to focus on how can art really bring nuance and criticality to the conversations we're having about who gets to make what and when and in what spaces. And how does that impact our ability to show up authentically so that we can fully be creative? I don't think we can do that if we're, you know, grappling with the expectations of others. And so we like to think of Four Freedoms as what my collaborator says, it's like a safe place to do dangerous things.
Well put, well put.
I think it's a little different from an engineering perspective. When I graduated from school 10 years ago, I think I was maybe 20% women in my graduating class of engineers. And now I teach. So I'm back at Stanford teaching this graduate mechanical engineering class called The Chair, and it's 50-50. And last year it was 50-50. And it's really heartening to see that. I mean, I don't want to be on the side of toxic positivity, but when you say something like equal pay was only 1970, and we're now, 50 years later, those people who were raised during that time when they still had that perception are now the ones running companies, but it's changing. And you see that shift over time, I think, is really heartening to women. And when you talk about display equity, I was laughing in my own head because I think about myself, like I'm this display equity where the guy running the machine shop at Stanford has been doing so for 50 years. I emailed him out of the blue and he gave me a shot to teach the course, and now the women coming up through the course have this example of someone and they see, oh, you can be a female engineer and you don't have to fit a certain prototype of what that looks like, and here's different ways that you can be an engineer and be a woman, and also kind of, I don't want to say I'm leading by example, but just leading by proof. And I think that's super important, especially when it comes to, it's just the showing that it exists and the art exists from these people and the work exists, I think is maybe on the more powerful side. And when we have like a Stanford student who can then intern at EMECO and be building chairs and be at the factory, and the guys at the factory get more used to it, and the people at the other companies get more used to it, and the sexism just starts to degrade. I think that's the powerful side of it for the display equity in engineering for me.
That's so awesome, and I love the positivity of that. That's so rad. But the other day, when I chatted with you guys, there were some different stories, and I was like, wait a minute, where's all this positivity coming from? So maybe you had a particularly funny one from your graduating days.
So I did my undergrad engineering and I did my master's degree in engineering, and when I showed up at graduation, I'm above 6 feet tall with heels on. I'm very blonde. The two guys in front of me, there were no blonde women in my graduating class for master's degrees. So the two guys in front of me start talking to each other and looking back at me, and then they talk to each other a little more, and then they look back at me and they go, "We're sorry, but we think you're in the wrong place." And it was like, are you kidding me? And the whole reason I had done this master's degree was my whole life I was like just trying to prove something and had this whole ego. I had to get into the hardest thing and prove myself and get good grades, and that these guys on graduating day could just be like, "No, you're wrong." And then I was like, "Wait, is this MSme?" And they're like, "Yeah." I'm like, "Is this for the masters?" And they're like, "Yeah." I'm like, "No, like, I'm graduating." I mean, it's so funny, but it's also like, okay, just gotta get a little bit used to that. I do think it's changed, but it can be an obstacle in the path for sure. If you can't laugh about it and you can't keep that confidence in yourself, it's pretty tough, but it's also makes them look pretty dumb too.
Well, if I can add quickly that story, because many of you know that I spent 15 years in Japan, right?
I'm going to pass this back to Kulapat. The add-on about hiring women and non-binary persons.
Yes,
we want to hear from you.
Well, we definitely hire the best people we can find. We don't really know what they are. But one thing I can say about my experience in Japan, I studied and worked in Japan for 15 years, right? And it's really sad because, Japan is one of the most futuristic and very advanced culture in the world. But when it comes to women, it's the opposite, right? Even this is many years ago, but we have almost 50-50 in university. Right, you go both in terms of undergraduate as well as masters, both in architecture and engineering as well. But when we all went into the same workforce, the men got to do the design, the women get to serve tea, right? Because construction and architecture is seen to be, women exactly what the experience is, which is draw out this experience in me that, women don't know how to deal with construction workers. Right, they don't really know how to go to construction site. They're going to wear heels on construction site. This is going to be dangerous. Like all this weird biased perception of what that is constructed in a way to keep half the population out of creative work, which even now still exists, right? And it's very difficult to change because, like what you say, the people continue to do that, and we unconsciously endorse that idea, like, we cannot go to construction because construction people don't understand how to take order from a woman, for example, right? Which is not true. Like, in our office, we have maybe half right now. So it's not the case, but how do we reposition that and talk about it in a different way that allow this to be a non-issue rather than, just finding it, but like how do we, I'm supposed to change it also is a big part of that, yes. Just want to add, yes.
If I could just quickly steer us further away from toxic positivity. So at Four Freedoms, we're artist-led, and we're kind of a collective. I mean, we've explored many different models of running an organization, anywhere from something that's totally non-hierarchical to something much more conventional. But nevertheless, it's inherently collaborative. We're collaborative in the way that we work with each other. We're collaborative in the way that we steward the work and how we choose to work with others too. And collaboration is a word that people love to throw around, but it's actually really hard and can be really ugly, you know. And I think it's ugly sometimes because we're human beings trying to figure things out together, take risks together, experiment together. And I think that it's really a labor of love, but you know, creativity and collaboration is also, it's care. It's a form of creative care. It's a labor of care, and in my work, I often see that labor falling to specific groups of people in these collaborative spaces, whether that's emotional care or administrative care. And so I think that over time, as I've worked with more people and learned from others, I am aware of the unconscious bias that I think I've internalized, even about people like myself. And so I really, that's the beauty of creativity, is that it helps snap us back into the present moment so that we can really reflect on what we're seeing and engaging with. And I think too, it's a great way for us to kind of pause and think about our role as a co-creator of whatever the thing is. And so that all goes to say that collaboration is hard. It often falls to people like me, labor-wise. And it's, you know, I'm lucky to work with folks who are amazing men also. But yeah, I just kind of wanted to make that point that collaboration is so important, and it really is about kind of keeping a community together. And it shouldn't fall to just one group.
Thanks, Michelle, for those thoughts. You know, one of the things we're looking at in our project is how labor does fall unequally to different people in sort of the constructs of how we have ideas about gender. And we're going to be doing some programming on that. I think that speaks so much to this question of economics, like how much can women earn, non-binary persons, men, like where are we on the spectrum, and what are the consequences of that, both in terms of what can be produced and everything that then flows from that. So as we've been talking, architecture responding to the work and so on and so forth. I wanted to turn the conversation to Tamar because we were having an interesting dialogue about this earlier, and you were bringing up some points that I thought were great. So passing it to you.
Oh, thank you. I don't remember exactly what points you wanted me to talk about. But at one point I mean, as far as an artist goes, to create art, you have to be financially supported by the market. And so, as I spoke before, in order to make work that's in more expensive materials, you have to have the money, the funding to create it. So like I identify as non-binary, but I was thinking about people who are transitioning or who have transitioned, and so they have this medical upkeep that they're always have an expense for, and that always takes a certain amount of money out of the purse that they have in order to create art. So it's an added, continuous expense. And then also in regards to the conversation we had earlier about labor, when I graduated graduate school, there were tons and tons of female artists and queer artists, as well as male. But I'll say that as I've gotten older, many of my female artists that graduated with me got married to male artists, had kids, and their relationships tended to be different than my queer friends, and that the labor was distributed in a very, what I feel, kind of antiquated way, where the male artist was making more money, and as artists, you don't have a paycheck, so it's things are a little much less secure. And over the years, and the female artists ended up doing more of the child labor, and then that affects the work that was made, and then the decisions that get made after all of that. And yeah, so that was also, it's a different kind of labor, and I'm not sure why, but in the art world, those relationships felt very antiquated, but very real, I think just because of financial concerns, they made those decisions in that way, and it really affected the work that was made, that had been produced by each individual within the relationship as well.
That's great, Tamara, thank you. I also wanted to acknowledge Tamara's been volunteering with us, and it's been so helpful for me to learn about my own bias, and I'm grateful for that, so thank you. I want to pass it back if anybody has any more thoughts to add here, and then maybe we'd open up to the audience to see if anyone has questions.
I see a lot of nods. So, Sandy.
I'm an active listener. But no, everything everyone has said resonates.
But you are so okay, I'm going to point you out.
Okay.
Creative mind in development, which again, is mostly men.
98% white male.
Right.
My company, which is an extremely, so my company, which is an extremely progressive company, it's owned by a socialist, a gay man, and a Holocaust survivor's child, which they openly, discuss how that informs the decisions we make about real estate, about community, about how we spend our money, how we deploy capital. So, I couldn't work in a more amazing environment for this conversation, but it's still 98% white men in my company. We just had our first female C-suite promotion, like in the last couple months. And so, sorry, I wasn't expecting to talk. I'm a little nervous. All of this just really resonates for me because I think even when people have the best intentions about the decisions they're making and the way they're deploying capital and their commitment to equity, it's still, to quote Michelle, really, really hard to get it right, and systemic change needs to happen, and it worries me. Anyway, how's that? Thank you for putting me on.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, yes.
One thing I've been thinking a lot about, Jay, is how the Nasher, is designed by a male architect, and I think I don't know, maybe it's too much to say, but perhaps as a male architect, he's thinking about men, and so this building is built for a collection of predominantly male artists, by a man, for men. And then I'm thinking about all these statistics we're seeing about how healthcare and how all these medical studies are always done on men, so there's no data points on women's health. And so it got me thinking about designing chairs and engineering chairs. And I'm sure you take into account the body when you're designing a chair. Can you talk about?
Yeah. I was actually thinking about this today. There's some standards that are kind of universal for designing chairs, different measurements that you would have as your go-to. But what you don't know, I know EMECO historically has worked with a lot of men. Most of those men have a woman that is their right hand that is actually vetting everything. To be honest, this is my dad here who has run EMECO. So would you say that's largely true?
Yes.
And at EMECO, you would also see that, and I think, that is problematic in its own, but we will leave that. But at EMECO, you will also see the people making the chairs. Our head of product development is a woman. Our CEO is actually a woman. Our head of marketing is a woman. we have women at the factory. And so when we have a design, like the chairs in the front here, this Za stool. It's a stool by Naoto Fukasawa, really talented Japanese designer. His right-hand woman, Knits, is vetting that design. Our head of product development, Nicole, vetting that design. I was working on it when this chair was in development. I'm also vetting that design. So it's so interesting that, yes, initially, I think the standards you see in books, the chairs you've seen historically, a lot of them are probably have a male signature on it, but you even look at something like Charles and Ray Eames, there is a woman vetting that design. And so I think, the credit isn't there yet. Actually, there's a product in here where we had met with the architect when I was 16, and I was with my dad, he took me, and we met with the architect who was designing this chair, and he said, he left the room, and his right-hand woman asked me what I wanted to be, and I said, I actually want to be an architect. And she said, don't do it. You're gonna be like me, graduated top of my class from Yale. It's gonna be a white man's signature on all my designs for the next 50 years. But I will say, she was still, there's that piece needs to change, but she's on those designs, the fingerprints are there. The signature isn't there yet, but the fingerprints are there.
Let's get the signature and the money. And the money.
On the check.
Yeah. We want it all, Jay. Thank you for more positivity, but we still want more. No, it's great. Does anyone else have a question in the audience they'd like to ask someone in the group?
I'll ask a question.
Uh-oh.
Well, I always kind of enjoy actual examples of things you could think of, because it's really outrageous. Some of the things that happen, and one example I'll start with is when Jay was in product development, and when he went to our extruders. Do you remember what happened?
Yeah.
So give it some examples, because this is just such a great example.
I went to our aluminum extruder, who's been down the street at EMECO. We do aluminum products since the 1940s. They've been our extruder for the majority of that time. I walked in with a skirt that was to my ankles and shoes on, and they said, you can't come in because you're in a skirt. So I was like, okay. I went down the street, went to the dollar store, bought a pair of jeans, came back, they were like 5 sizes too big, and got a shoelace, tied them up, and said, okay, I'm ready to go through the extruder now. But I don't know why you want me to tell this story.
It was just so outrageous, and I just,
yeah.
I think we could talk, but when you hear these examples of, there's stuff that still goes on.
Yeah.
It's appalling. That's all, and it just it makes you realize.
But I have a question for you, Greg. You brought it on yourself. So anyone who might not know, so Greg is the father of Jay. They're like the power duo behind EMECO. But you must have done something that put her here, right? So what's your thoughts about this process? You see her grow up as a girl. Right. She grew up with the business. Right, and now she's your partner in everything you do.
Right.
So tell us about that process.
Well, there's definitely an incredible relationship between fathers and daughters. But in our case, I have a son and a daughter, and they were just equals, and they were treated equally, and they had all the same opportunities to do anything they wanted to do, and so it was a matter of, in our house, women and men were equal.
I think you left the magic out there. Right? There's something, because I know you for many years now, and I see how you work, the trust
Well, I
is
did brainwash her because I knew what.
No, it's not that, because she's so independent and free spirit. Right? I think that's not the case at all. It's not like you want her to work with you on, but I see the freedom as well, but I felt like that's something that we need to learn from, because we talk about the subconscious, this kind of natural process of bringing everything in an equal manner. Questions? Well, okay, I'm going to point out Hubert right here, who's our, we have lured another friend into LA, and Hubert is actually will be teaching the ethics of business at UCLA. And so I want to hear your reflection on this subject.
And was not expecting as well, so sorry for my Franglish. I didn't practice the words I had to speak in American. So as Kulapat was
teaching, so yeah.
So that's why I know how to do actually to speak with people. But so now I'm reflecting. I'm thinking about one thing. I've been working myself in the media ecosystem for 15 years. I work for Bertelsmann, which is our European Disney. And I've been fighting actually for equality, like in our boards, which was kind of already like done because we have been at Bertelsmann like really pushing this for 20, 30 years. The journalists actually were not back in the days growing to the top of the company, and we really settled the ethics of the company in the past, like let's say 10 to 15 years. And it really, really worked, and we actually could bring journalists on top of the company. But it's a very specific thing. I've been actually teaching at Parsons in the past few years. Parsons is the contrary. I have like 95% women students, so it resonates into the heads. But yeah, that's the two examples I can say for now. And
so what will you be teaching at UCLA?
So I'm going to be teaching business ethics. So it's we speak a lot about this actually, trying to find equality into the boards, especially how to like create them. I'm also like speaking about media. So I created an NGO actually to fight misinformation in the rural zones, which is one of the core problems we have at the moment in our democracies, because the core of democracy is community, and the community is breaking away. And I think the women has a very strong power into the building of the community. So if we don't maintain this power, actually we're gonna go into terrible things. So yeah, we're like fighting for it, and I'm teaching about it actually in my classes. So yeah,
thank you. Any comments or questions?
I actually have one comment in response to Greg's.
I have one comment too.
Oh.
I have the mic. I'll pass it to you.
She's going to end with
yeah, she's going to. That's
it'll
right.
be positive.
Oh, yeah. No, I'm not giving it.
Yeah.
No, what I wanted to say is like, there are these examples of like, yeah, we have the same number of women as we do men or whatnot, but there are a lot of women at the bottom and a lot of men at the top, or what's the equality of pay? So that needs to be acknowledged here. I've seen the insides of a lot of these places we're talking about, and it isn't equal. So I do want to say that. But okay, some more positivity.
Well, I think the one thing is, Greg did raise us as equals in response to this, but the magic was that it was equals in terms of given the same chance to do things, but also you always told me how powerful it is to be a woman in the room, and how important my voice is, and how important it is to show up, and how cool it is to be a woman engineer. So I think it was equal, but you also really reinforced that side of it. That was a little different because my older brother didn't want to be an engineer. So it wasn't like you both need to be engineers. It was like, if that's what you want to do, this is so powerful. So yeah, positive.
That was great, Jaye. Thank you. Well, I'd like to thank everyone for coming. Did you want to add a comment? Oh, we're not done.
I have some actually in response to your comment, where you had mentioned that women hold the community together. I feel like I'm not thinking this through thoroughly, but in a way that feels a little still stereotypical. And I think that if we're going to talk about gender inclusivity, and also like how you were raised, I had my own really great parental upbringing. But I think everyone has their own experience also, not only with your parents or your family, but how you're treated within the world as you age. And and so that affects how you, not only how you communicate, but how you affect your presence around you. And so I say like women holding the community together is stereotypical, because I don't think every woman here or in the world lives the same, and so they may have a different effect onto the world. And everyone also communicates differently, and there's definitely a stereotypical masculine way of expressing oneself or holding space, one might say. And there are other ways of holding space and communicating. And I think that needs to be, I don't know, I don't work in a company, so I'm not sure what really exists on boards or in any which way, but I do think that that needs to be recognized, that one may have, one may hold space differently, but still have important things to communicate, and in a different tone. And then that affects also the way one perceives the world and what one has to say. So, yeah.
Thank you, Tamar. That's great. Well, I'm going to cease to hold this community together anymore. So we're going to hold ourselves together out there. And I want to thank everyone for joining this great conversation. And I'm very excited to continue it